When I opened the glove compartment in my husband's car, I found a box of condoms that had been opened. We hadn't used those for 20 years, because he always said they were uncomfortable. I didn't say a word. I just quietly sprinkled pepper into each packet. And what happened next forced our neighbors to call an ambulance in an emergency. I'm so glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to my channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my revenge story from. I want to know how far it has traveled. The moment I closed that glove compartment, the sound was small but final, like the end of a prayer you no longer believe in. The air inside the garage hung heavy, still carrying the faint smell of Richard's cologne and motor oil. I stared at the dashboard for a long time, my fingers resting on the cold edge of the leather seat. 20 years of marriage, and I was sitting inside a stranger's car. I could have screamed. God knows, I've screamed before into pillows, into quiet rooms where no one cared to listen. But that morning, the anger didn't explode. It folded itself neatly inside me, like a letter I wasn't ready to open. I went back inside the house and stood in the kitchen, my eyes tracing the steam curling out of the kettle. The sunlight hit the countertop, golden and sharp, revealing the smallest dust particles dancing in the air. Everything felt exaggerated, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock, even my own heartbeat. Betrayal makes ordinary sounds too loud. I reached into the spice drawer and pulled out the pepper grinder. It was the same one we bought the first year we opened our flower shop, Roberts & Bloom. We used to joke that he'd handle the numbers while I handled the petals. Turns out he was handling more than that. I remember twisting the grinder once, letting a few grains fall into my palm. Sharp, familiar, honest. Pepper doesn't lie, it tells you exactly what it is the moment you taste it. I poured some into a small bowl, then added a few drops of oil, mixing it gently until the scent hit my nose, bold, fiery, alive. It wasn't vengeance I felt. It was clarity. People think rage looks like breaking things. Sometimes it looks like a woman in her 50s quietly preparing her next move while the kettle cools beside her. When I walked back to the garage, the light had shifted, spilling through the half-open blinds in thin, trembling lines. I slipped on a pair of gloves, a habit from years of handling lilies whose pollen stains everything they touch. I opened the box again. Each silver packet glimmered under the light. Too clean, too new, a mockery of the life we used to share. Carefully, methodically, I opened them one by one, just a pinch. Not to harm, just enough to make the truth impossible to ignore. Each packet sealed again, smooth and perfect. There was something meditative in the repetition. Anger turned into precision. Fear turned into focus. As I worked, my reflection in the car window caught my eye. The woman staring back didn't look furious. She looked awake, and that realization hit harder than the betrayal itself. By the time I was done, the house smelled faintly of chili oil and lemon soap. I washed my hands twice, threw the gloves away, and wiped down every surface I'd touched. Then I made tea, the same blend I always made, with a slice of lemon and a spoonful of honey. Routine has its uses. It keeps your hands busy while your mind rearranges the chaos. When you've been betrayed, you start to see how much of your life has been lived on autopilot. I'd spent years pouring love into someone who couldn't hold it without spilling. But love isn't wasted just because it ends. It becomes experience, it becomes data. And data, in the right hands, is strategy. I sat by the kitchen window, watching the reflection of the driveway in the glass. The car sat there, innocent, quiet, holding my secret inside it. I didn't feel triumphant, just calm. There's a kind of power in not reacting the way they expect you to. Richard came home early that afternoon. He looked the same as he always did, pressed shirt, expensive watch, the faint smell of aftershave that used to comfort me. He kissed the top of my head as he passed by, asked if I wanted dinner from Mulberry's. I said that would be nice. He didn't notice the pepper grinder still sitting on the counter. He never noticed the small things. That was his first mistake. As he left again, I watched him from the window. He walked with that same confident stride, the kind of arrogance only a man with a secret can wear. He looked untouchable. But secrets are flammable. You just have to know how to light them. I leaned against the counter and thought about the woman I used to be, the one who always chose peace over confrontation, who believed that silence was grace. But silence, I've learned, is just permission when you give it to the wrong person. The truth is, I didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. What I wanted was proof that I wasn't crazy, that the unease I'd felt for years had a name, that the intuition I kept burying under politeness was, in fact, wisdom. Sometimes people mistake calm for weakness. They don't realize calm is just anger that has learned discipline. As the evening settled, I poured myself a glass of wine and turned on the radio. A song from our wedding year played soft, nostalgic, ironic. I laughed quietly to myself. Memory has a cruel sense of humor. I toasted the air anyway. To truth, I whispered. May it sting just enough to wake you. I cleaned up the kitchen and took out the trash. The night air outside was crisp, scented with garden soil and the faint sweetness of the lilies I'd planted by the porch. They used to be Richard's favorite. I used to think that meant something. From across the street, I saw our neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, watering her marigolds. She waved. I waved back. Her husband passed years ago, but she still talks to him sometimes when she's out in the garden. She once told me that grief is just love that doesn't know where to go. Maybe betrayal is the same thing. Back inside, I turned off the lights. The house sank into its usual stillness. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hall, the hum of the fridge, the far-off sound of a car engine, maybe pulling away into the night. I didn't feel like a woman scorned. I felt like a scientist waiting for the results of an experiment. Patience, I reminded myself. The truth has a way of revealing itself, and when it does, you want to be composed enough to take notes. As I climbed the stairs, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The faint lines around my eyes, the calm set of my mouth, the steadiness in my gaze. I didn't recognize this version of me completely, but I liked her. She looked like someone who had finally stopped asking for permission to feel. In the quiet of our bedroom, I turned down the sheets on my side of the bed and left his untouched. The pillow next to me still carried the faint scent of his cologne. I lay there and stared at the ceiling fan turning lazily above. Every spin sounded like a countdown. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I disagree. Revenge, when done right, is served calm, seasoned with restraint, timed to perfection. Before I drifted to sleep, I thought about the pepper grinder sitting by the sink. How something so ordinary could become a symbol of control. How every small choice that day, the quiet, the patience, the precision, wasn't about him at all. It was about reclaiming myself, grain by grain. When the siren echoed down the street the next morning, slicing through the early light, I didn't move. I just sat up slowly, the corner of my mouth curving, and whispered to no one in particular, truth always burns before it cleanses. Our house used to smell like lilies. Now it smells like absence. It's a scent you don't notice at first, quiet, polite, almost considerate. But it seeps in slowly, settling into the walls, the curtains, even the spaces between words at dinner. Absence doesn't announce itself. It lingers, patient and loyal, like the ghost of love. Richard had always loved lilies. He said they reminded him of new beginnings. Every Sunday, we'd bring a fresh bouquet from the shop and place it in the vase by the window. Now, the same vase holds a bundle of dried stems, brittle, brown, their scent faint and hollow. I should have thrown them out weeks ago, but I didn't. Maybe because they still stood upright, pretending to be what they once were. That's what our marriage felt like in the end, upright, intact, lifeless. The day I found out about the company papers, I remember it was raining, the kind of soft, deliberate rain that makes the whole world sound like it's sighing. I was sitting in my office at the shop, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the ticking of the clock behind me. Numbers always made me calm. Orders, invoices, receipts. They were the language of predictability, and I had built my life around that kind of safety. The accountant, a young woman named Nora, came in with a folder tucked under her arm. She smiled awkwardly. "There's just something small we need you to sign, Mrs. Roberts." "Routine for the audit," she said. I trusted her. I trusted everyone who said something was routine. When I opened the folder, I saw the transfer documents. The top line read, "Ownership adjustment due to tax restructuring." It was dated 6 months ago. Richard's name was listed as the sole proprietor. Mine had been crossed out in neat final strokes. I blinked at it for a long time. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I saw his signature, bold, deliberate, confident. The same one who once signed our wedding license. It's strange how betrayal looks on paper. So quiet, so official. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just ink drying into silence. I called Richard that afternoon. He answered on the second ring, his voice as smooth as ever. "Hey love, everything okay?" I wanted to ask him why, but the question got stuck somewhere between my heart and my throat. Instead I said, "There's a new document from the audit. It says you transferred the company." He chuckled softly, the way you do when a child misunderstands something simple. "Oh, that," he said. "It's just paperwork. Easier for tax reasons. You don't have to worry about it. Just paperwork." Those two words settled into me like dust after a collapse. That's what our life had become, a stack of signed forms, filed emotions, and neatly worded dismissals. I hung up quietly, staring at the rain outside. Drops streaked down the glass like the years I couldn't account for anymore. How many times had I trusted his explanations because they sounded reasonable? How many times had I confused calmness with control? That night, when he came home, the kitchen felt too clean, too rehearsed. I served dinner: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, the same meal we used to share when life felt simple. He talked about work, politics, and the rising cost of roses. I nodded, smiled at the right moments, and said goodnight when he leaned in to kiss my cheek, the choreography of civility. But something inside me shifted. There's a kind of silence that isn't peace, it's erasure, and I realized, slowly, that I had been erased long before that day. After he went to bed, I walked through each room of our house. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent, the living room of old furniture. The flower shop ledger sat open on the dining table, half filled with my handwriting meticulous loops, careful numbers, proof that I existed, that I built something real. On the mantel, a photo of us from our first year together smiled back. My hair was longer, my laughter unguarded. His hand rested on my shoulder, a gesture that once felt like protection. Now it looked like possession. I picked up the photo and turned it face down. Not out of anger, but clarity. There's a moment when love turns from memory into evidence, and I had just crossed it. I remember standing by the window after midnight, the garden dark, except for the faint shimmer of dew on the lilies. Their petals were drooping, heavy with water. I thought about how easy it was for something beautiful to drown quietly. When I was younger, I believed love was about endurance. My mother used to say that marriage is like tending flowers, you have to water it even when you don't feel like it. But she never said what to do when someone keeps cutting the roots behind your back. The next morning, I made coffee and poured 2 cups out of habit. Richard came downstairs in his usual rush, checking his phone, brushing crumbs off his shirt. He didn't notice I'd already signed the audit papers. He didn't notice that I didn't ask questions. That was his second mistake. He thought my quiet meant acceptance. He took his coffee to go, kissed the top of my head and said, "Don't forget the dinner with Ethan tonight." Our son, the one thing Richard and I still shared without argument. Ethan worked with the fire department in the next town. Brave, kind, everything his father had stopped being. I smiled and nodded, but my mind was already elsewhere. After he left, I opened the safe in the study and took out the old business registration documents, the original ones from when we first opened the shop. My name was right there beside his, written in ink that had faded but not disappeared. Proof again. Love might rot, but integrity doesn't. That day, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I spent hours at the shop, pruning wilted stems, trimming away dead leaves, and rearranging bouquets. There's something therapeutic about cutting away decay. It teaches you what still deserves to grow. When I came home that evening, the lilies by the window had finally collapsed, their petals scattered across the sill like fallen paper. I swept them gently into my palm and placed them in a bowl. Not to mourn them, but to remember what they'd once been. Richard came home late, smelling of expensive whiskey and someone else's perfume. He smiled, careless and charming, the way he always did when he needed to reset the scene. I greeted him with the same gentle voice I'd always used, and that was when I knew he hadn't noticed a thing. People think revenge is loud, but the real kind begins in silence, in the spaces between words like, "It's just paperwork." That night, as I lay awake beside him, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the lilies, the ones that had once filled our home with scent and meaning. I remembered how their fragrance used to cling to my hands, how Richard would say it reminded him of new beginnings. Now I knew he wasn't talking about ours. When dawn came, I got up, brewed fresh coffee, and opened the flower shop early. The first customer walked in, smiled, and said, "You always make the lilies look so alive." I smiled back. That's the trick, I thought. Even dead flowers can look alive if you arrange them carefully enough. That's what I'd been doing all these years, arranging the ruins of a marriage to look like love. But that morning, as the sunlight filled the shop and the smell of lilies returned, I decided that even absence can bloom again if you let it. Curiosity doesn't kill love, it just proves it was dying already. I didn't mean to look. I wasn't searching for anything that morning. I was just cleaning the study, a room Richard rarely let me touch anymore. The air in there always felt slightly stale, as if it held its breath for him alone. His laptop sat on the mahogany desk, lid half open, humming quietly. It looked harmless, like a sleeping pet. I wiped the dust from the surface and pressed the power button to close it properly. The screen came alive before I could stop myself. The glow filled the room, a cold blue light that painted everything honest. There, on the screen, an unread email blinked in the corner of his inbox. Just one line of preview text is visible. "You were amazing tonight, Dad." For a second, I froze. My mind tried to make sense of it, to assemble a logic that didn't break me. Dad. The word cut through my ribs like glass. We didn't have daughters, only Ethan. So who, then, was calling him that, and in such a tone? I stared at the screen, my breath shallow, my pulse loud in my ears. I told myself to close it, to walk away, to pretend ignorance was mercy. But curiosity is a quiet rebellion. I clicked. The message was short, almost innocent if you read it without context. "You were amazing tonight, Dad. I can't stop thinking about you." Then a red heart. No signature, just a strange email address, a jumble of letters and numbers, not even a name. It could have been spam, a cruel mistake, but something in me knew it wasn't. Betrayal has a scent, and once you've smelled it, you can't mistake it for anything else. I took a slow breath. The screen light shimmered against the reflection of my hands, steady but cold. I didn't take a screenshot. Instead, I wrote down the details: time, sender, subject line on a small notepad. Evidence wasn't about catching someone in one lie. It was about watching how many they were willing to tell. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time, my mind replaying every moment that now felt different under this light. Every late-night meeting, every business trip, every tired sigh. The signs had been there all along. I just kept rearranging them into kindness. When Richard came home that evening, the house was quiet except for the rhythmic hum of the dishwasher. He walked in, loosened his tie, and gave me that half-smile and expression so practiced it had stopped meaning anything. He asked about dinner, about orders at the shop, about Ethan, everything but us. I answered softly, each word measured, my tone calm. I watched his face under the warm kitchen light, and all I could think about was the blue glow of that screen. How truth and deception can live in the same man, depending on the light. He excused himself after dinner, saying he had to finish reports in the study. When he closed the door, I heard the faint click of the lock. He thought I didn't notice. He thought I never did. But I did. Every small sound in a house like ours means something. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan turning above me, its blades slicing through the dark like slow, deliberate thoughts. The rhythm of it matched my heartbeat. Steady and unnerving. I wasn't angry. Anger is noisy. Childish. What I felt was worse clarity. People talk about intuition as if it's some mystical gift. But for women like me, it's a survival instinct, sharpened by years of listening to silence. When something shifts, even slightly, you feel it in your bones. The next morning I made breakfast as usual, oatmeal, fruit, and coffee. Routine steadied me. Richard came down, kissed my forehead, and sat across the table. He checked his phone while eating, his eyes flickering with that same distant focus. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was familiar, lived in. He left for work soon after, and I stood by the window watching his car disappear down the street. My reflection in the glass looked calm, composed, almost serene. But inside, my thoughts were rearranging themselves like chess pieces. I returned to the study. The faint smell of his cologne lingered, mixed with the dust from yesterday. I turned on the laptop again, careful to move the mouse exactly where it had been. The inbox was clean this time, the message gone. Deleted, or hidden in another folder. That confirmed it. Whatever this was, it wasn't an accident. He was careful now. I searched the history, but he'd cleared it. the digital equivalent of a freshly polished conscience. He thought wiping the record made it disappear. But nothing ever truly disappears. It only waits for the right eyes to find it. I leaned back in his chair, looking at the rows of books lining the shelves. Titles about business, leadership, growth words he liked to use as shields. He always said he built our flower business on trust and strategy. He just never said who he was strategizing against. Later that afternoon, Ethan stopped by the shop. He looked tired, the way young men do when they've seen too much of life too early. He hugged me, and for a brief moment, I forgot about everything. He smelled of smoke and sunlight remnants of his shift at the fire station. "Mom, you okay?" he asked. "You seem quieter than usual." I smiled. "I've just been thinking," I said. He nodded, not pressing. He was always like that, gentle, intuitive. Richard had none of those qualities. After Ethan left, I stood by the counter, hands deep in a bucket of water filled with lilies. The stems were smooth under my fingers, slick and fragile. I trimmed the wilted edges, arranged them into vases. One wrong cut, and the whole bloom would die. But trimmed right, it could last another week. Love is like that, I thought. It's not about avoiding pain. It's about knowing what to cut before it infects the rest. When I got home, Richard was in the living room watching the news. His laptop sat closed beside him. I asked casually, "How was your day?" He said, "Fine." I asked if he had time to review the quarterly reports. He nodded without looking up. Every lie sounds like the truth when you want it to. I watched him for a moment longer, then turned away. I wasn't ready to confront him yet. Not because I was afraid, but because timing is everything. Truth, like pepper, needs the right moment to burn. Before bed, I checked the notepad again, rereading the line I'd written. "You were amazing tonight, Dad." The words didn't make me cry. They made me plan. Because that's the thing about betrayal, it hands you a map. You just have to decide where it leads. I slipped the notepad into my drawer and turned off the light. The room sank into darkness, but the faint blue glow from the digital clock on the nightstand reminded me of the screen. The light of deceit and revelation intertwined. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to think. Every secret leaves a trail, and every liar eventually returns to where they started. All I had to do was follow the scent of truth until it led me to the fire. Sometimes, the scent of another woman tells a story louder than any confession. I noticed it first in the car the morning after the email. I slid into the passenger seat to fetch my sunglasses, and the air changed the moment the door closed. Not my perfume, not detergent. Something younger and too eager, sweet at the start and then strangely metallic at the back of the throat. I sat still and let it settle around me the way you sit with smoke, to learn where the fire is. The glove compartment looked ordinary. The dashboard looked ordinary. Only the air had changed its name. I opened the vents and pressed my palm near them. Warmth breathed out, carrying that sweetness like a secret being repeated. It clung to the seatbelt and the stitching on the leather. The scent had that high, sugary note that new perfumes use when they want to sound innocent. Underneath it, I caught a whisper of heat that did not belong to any bottle at a department store. A quiet ghost of the oil I had blended in my kitchen. Not loud, not bragging. Just there if you knew how to listen. I sat back and watched dust move through a slash of light. Memory rearranged itself without asking permission. Years of lilies in a vase by our window. Years of quiet dinners and careful questions. Years of calling calm the same thing as safety. The car did not argue with me. It simply offered evidence. The perfume announced a visitor. The heat underneath confirmed intent. I closed the door and let the day begin. At the shop, I kept my hands moving. Cut, dip, arrange. The rhythm steadied me. A delivery came in with peonies that still held the morning on their petals and tulips that leaned toward the light like small prayers. A woman ordered an apology bouquet for her sister. She asked if white roses were too formal. I told her white says I will not argue with you today. Pink says I remember how to be soft. She chose both and looked grateful. People think a florist sells color. Really, we translate feeling into stems and ribbon. It is hard to lie when your hands smell like water and green things. Around noon, Mrs. Peterson from across the street wandered in for her usual chat. She bought marigold seeds for spring and a single lily to place near her husband's photo. She asked how I was. I said I was learning to hear my house again. She nodded like she understood. Before she left, she leaned close and lowered her voice the way neighbors do when they believe news is a kindness. There were sirens on Willow last night. Not a fire, an ambulance, young voices. Someone had a bad reaction, they say. I felt the ground tilt an inch and then steady. I rang her up. I wrapped the lily in tissue. I thanked her and locked the door behind her with a sign that said back in 15, even though I knew I would not be. I stood very still and listened to the cooler hum and the soft click of the clock. I let my breath slow until my thoughts matched it one by one. The phone buzzed. Ethan. He said he might be late after the shift change and asked if I needed help with a delivery to the courthouse. I told him I could manage. He added that there had been an ambulance call near Riverlight. Allergic reaction. Awful timing. He sounded tired. I told him to drink water and to text me when he got home. I did not ask for details. I had already heard what I needed to hear. In the afternoon sun, I returned to the car for a ribbon sample. The scent was stronger now that the heat had baked it into the surfaces. Perfume tries to tell a pretty story. Time edits it, sweet turns sour on leather, and truth rises through the stitch lines like steam. The high note had softened, and the bottom note of warmth pressed forward. That warmth was mine. Not a boast. A fact. When Richard came home that evening, he carried a grocery bag and the smile of a man who believes in the camouflage of routine. He said Mulberry's was out of roasted chicken, so he brought salmon. He asked about orders. He kissed my temple as if a gesture could become proof. I stirred a pot and felt the heat bloom against my face. There was a faint halo of that unfamiliar sweetness near his collar. I tasted the air the way a cook tastes a sauce. People reveal themselves through the trails they leave in rooms. During dinner, he talked about suppliers and a new wholesale account that might need hydrangeas by the case. He spoke quickly and avoided the edges of our conversation the way someone carefully drives around a pothole they helped create. He asked nothing about my day. I did not volunteer. Silence is a tool when you learn to hold it by the handle. After the dishes, I wiped the counter and let the sponge slide over the same patch of tile again and again until it squeaked. He stood in the doorway with his glass and asked if I wanted to watch something. I said I had emails to send for the shop. He nodded and said he would be in the study. The door closed. The click was quiet but practiced. My hand kept moving long after the counter was clean. That is how the body buys time for the mind to catch up. The phone rang. It was Rosa who baked for the church. She whispered the way people do when they are trying to be gentle with the truth. Did you hear about the young woman from the legal office near the river? They took her to the county last night. Something about a skin reaction. Poor thing. She said poor thing twice as if repetition might soften the sharpness. I thanked her for letting me know. I asked if she needed vanilla. She laughed and said I always know what a baker needs. When I hung up, I went to the sink and washed my hands even though they were clean. The soap smelled like lemon. The water ran hot. The steam lifted and disappeared. I stood there with my palms under the stream and understood something simple and difficult. Consequences are not revenge. They are mirrors. Sometimes they arrive dressed like accidents, so we can bear to look. Later, I walked out to the porch and sat with the night. The neighborhood was quiet in that way that tells you everyone is home and trying to be good. The porch light drew a halo on the step. Moths orbited it slowly as if thinking. Somewhere, a sprinkler switched on and sprinkled water into the grass. The air held that barely there hint of heat I knew too well. I breathed it in and let a small smile touch my mouth, then fade. This was not a triumph. This was confirmation. Richard joined me with a blanket over his arm. He placed it on my shoulders as a kindness. He said the city might contract us for a courthouse gala again. He asked if I wanted to take a weekend trip to the coast in the spring. He sounded like a man eager to rewrite a sentence without changing its meaning. I said we could talk about it. In the quiet that followed, he reached for my hand. I let him hold it. My palms stayed still. When we went inside, he paused at the mirror in the hall and adjusted his collar. He looked into his own eyes and smiled that small smile people practice for strangers. I watched him, watching himself, and felt a strange calm. He was at peace with the version of him in the glass. The version next to me was made of fog. Before bed, I watered the lilies in the kitchen and noticed one petal had browned along the edge, the way heat kisses a sugar rim. I touched it, and it broke cleanly in two. Sweet turned brittle. Pretty turned proof. I placed the petal in the trash and washed the glass with cool water. The vase rang like a quiet bell when it met the counter. I lay awake longer than I meant to. The house made its small night noises, pipes settling, a branch brushes the siding, the tick of the clock that lives in the hall and refuses to whisper. I thought about timing and about restraint and about the discipline it takes to let a story reveal its own plot. I thought about the email and the scent and the laughter I had not heard from him in a very long time. I thought about Lena, who once asked me how to keep lilies from staining her dress, and how I told her to remove the anthers early if she wanted to keep the white clean. She thanked me and smiled. People always smile when you give them the trick that prevents a mess. It does not always mean they will use it. Just before sleep, the phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from an unknown number that had accidentally included me in a group thread about a rescheduled meeting at a familiar hotel. Riverlight tomorrow at noon. I stared at the name in the list. A legal assistant whose office ordered bouquets from us last Valentine's Day. My eyes closed on their own. Fate sometimes writes in neat handwriting. In the morning, I woke to a kitchen that smelled like coffee and something faint that memory translated as heat. The house looked the same. The world looked the same. Only my posture had changed. I moved through the rooms with a steadiness I recognized from women who carry water jars on their heads and never spill a drop. The day opened like a curtain. I stepped through. By noon, a rumor had become a report. The legal office closed early. A young woman was resting at the county. No details offered, none needed. I stood at the shop window and watched light roll across the street in long, slow waves. In the glass, I saw my reflection and the reflection of the lilies behind me. They nodded like women who have already made up their minds. Karma does not rush. It remembers. It takes the long way around and arrives on time. Grief made me quiet. Curiosity made me dangerous. The morning after the rumors about Riverlight, I unlocked the shop before sunrise and let the cool air settle on my skin. The city was still half asleep. In that half-light, I made a list with the same careful hand I used to wire orchids. When your heart is in pieces, you sort the shards by size. Orders, invoices, questions. A single name at the bottom like a seed waiting for water. Thomas Graham. He used to be a detective before he started recovering lost vans and verifying insurance claims for small businesses like mine. Years ago, when a delivery truck vanished, he found it in a day and said something I never forgot. Panic is loud, evidence is patient. I called him from the back office where the cooler hummed like a steady breath. He answered on the second ring and did not fill the silence with apologies or surprise. He asked for the facts. I gave him only what he needed. An open box in a glove compartment. A deleted email that began with, "You were amazing tonight, Dad." A hospital rumor. The pattern of a man who moved through rooms without leaving eye contact behind. He asked if I wanted to meet. Haven Cafe at noon, the corner table by the window. He would be the one with a spiral notebook and a face that looked like it had already decided to believe me. Haven smelled like roasted beans and old book spines. The bell over the door made a sound like something remembered. He was there when I arrived, stocky and unhurried, with hands that looked like they preferred listening to pointing. He did not ask if I was sure. He asked if I was ready. I nodded. He slid a legal pad across the table and a cheap pen that wrote, like it owed the truth a favor. I told him about the laptop glow and the single red heart, about the perfume that did not belong to me and the heat under it that did, about the audit file that was called theft paperwork. He wrote in short lines, the way you write when you want to keep facts from dressing up as feelings. He asked for dates and times and names. He asked if I had any reason to suspect the woman whose scent had moved into my car. I said a name I did not want to taste. Lena. He did not flinch. You understand the cost of knowing, he said. I said I had already paid the cost of not knowing. He nodded. Then he said something that sounded like a prayer a cop might keep in his pocket. Truth is not a rescue boat. It is a light. You still have to swim. We agreed on boundaries. He would not enter my house. He would pull public records and check hotel logs and review street cameras within legal limits. He would not promise outcomes. He would deliver what existed. He also asked if I wanted the work done quietly or fast. I said both if he could manage it. He smiled then, a small, tired smile. That is what everyone asks, he said, but your voice makes it sound possible. He left with a list, and I left with an empty cup and a steadier spine. Outside, the sky had cleared into a blue so plain it looked honest. I walked back to the shop past the courthouse steps where we had once set gladiolus in straight lines for a memorial service. Balance comes one stem at a time. I kept repeating that until it felt like breath. The day stretched thin, and work filled the spaces. I tied bows that would be untied by people I would never meet. I trimmed brown from the edges of a dozen white lilies until they looked newly awake. Every cut was a decision to keep only what could still live. Sometimes that is the only strategy you need. Just before closing, the phone lit up with an unknown number. A text. Check your email. Simple as that. A minute later, an inbox ping. An attachment waited like a held breath. I locked the shop door, drew the backroom shade, and opened the file on the old laptop that has never lied to me. The folder was labeled Riverlight Stills. Inside were photos with timestamps in the corner. A glass door. A polished lobby floor. A man who knew how to look like everyone and no one. Richard. A woman beside him in a dress that pretended to be casual. Lena. They were not holding hands in the first frame. They were in the second. I clicked through them carefully and felt nothing theatrical, just the quiet click of proof attaching itself to the inside of my ribs. This is what a lie looks like in daylight. It is not dramatic. It is ordinary and undeniable. Another folder. Transactions. Room charges billed to a card I recognized from home. 2 nights are listed as separate bookings that overlapped for everything but shame. A note at the bottom from Thomas. Public desk confirmation obtained with routine inquiry. No laws broken to gather. I exhaled for what felt like the first time that day. Then I saw a third file, a short video that looked like it came from a street camera across from the Riverlight entrance. A still car. A figure stepping out of the passenger side. A laugh that never carried to the microphone. A hand on a shoulder. The kind of touch you do not use if you are carrying a truth you could defend. I closed the file and stared at my reflection in the black screen. My face looked older and kinder at once, not because I forgave anything, because I had stopped asking myself to pretend. A knock sounded at the front door. I started and then remembered I had agreed to meet Thomas after closing. He stood there with a small envelope and the same quiet he wore at the cafe. He did not step inside until I waved him in. He set the envelope on the counter and rested his hands on the glass like a man at a chapel rail. "You should have this on a drive," he said. Emails and stills, and the metadata were pulled in a clean way. I asked if he had more, and he nodded. Enough to confirm a pattern. Not enough to satisfy curiosity if you have an appetite for every detail. But enough to meet the burden of proof if this ever needs a judge. I asked the question I had not wanted to ask all day. "How certain are you?" He met my eyes and did not look away. Certain enough to make a plan. He slid the flash drive from the envelope. It was small and silver and ordinary. Funny how justice sometimes arrives looking like a house key. He cleared his throat. "There is one more thing," he said. "You mentioned an email beginning with Dad. The address is masked, but the origin server and time window line up with a device registered to the legal office that handles your audits." He let the implication stand on its own feet. Lena. The name made a shape in the air and then vanished. Some truths do not need to be repeated. They only need room. He asked if I wanted him to continue. I told him yes, but not to chase shadows. Only facts. Only those that stand up under light. He slipped a card across the counter. "You already know this," he said, "but I will say it anyway. Do not confront him yet. Confrontation feeds liars. Evidence starves them." After he left, I held the flash drive in my palm for a long time. It felt cool at first and then warmed with the heat of my hand. A tiny, unblinking witness. I unlocked the office drawer where I keep the old registration papers for Roberts and Bloom and placed the drive beside them. Paper and metal, ink and code, memory and machine. All of it is a chorus that would not have to raise its voice. I turned off the shop lights and stood for a moment in the glow of the street outside. People passed by carrying takeout bags and weekday disappointments and bouquets for reasons I did not need to know. Life went on with its stubborn grace. The window held my reflection and the faint outlines of lilies behind me. I looked like a woman who had learned to breathe underwater. At home, I brewed chamomile and sat by the window where the night pretends to be kind. Richard texted that he would be late. He used 4 words and a period. He believed punctuation could keep a story neat. I put the phone face down and listened to the kettle cool. Then I opened my notebook and wrote the only sentence that mattered. The truth does not need a stage, it needs a record. When sleep finally came, it felt earned and thin. I dreamed of long hallways with doors that opened onto sunlit rooms where nothing hid. I woke before dawn with the sense that the house had moved a half-inch closer to itself. I made coffee and traced a finger along the spine of our original business certificate. My name sat there steady next to his as if it had been practicing endurance for this exact morning. On my way to the shop, I drove past Riverlight and did not look away. The glass reflected a sky that promised nothing and still felt generous. Somewhere inside, a desk clerk was setting out pens, and a lobby was being polished until it gleamed like a lie. I did not need to despise the building to understand what had happened there. Places are innocent. People give them stories. At the counter, I placed the flash drive in a small velvet ring box and closed the lid, not to make it precious, to keep it from being touched until the right hands asked for it. I arranged the morning lilies the way I always do. Snip, angle, set. The room filled with that clean white fragrance that made entire days feel new when I still believed newness was something you could buy. Grief had made me quiet. Curiosity had taught me how to move like a surgeon through my own life. Evidence would make me unassailable. I did not need to shout. I needed to keep records and let the light do what it has always done. When the bell chimed and the first customer stepped in, I smiled and asked what they wanted the flowers to say, because that is what we sell here after all, not petals, messages. And mine, written in paper and pixels and dates, now said something I could live with. It said you are not crazy. It said you were right. It is said to be ready. If they wanted my company, they would have to sign for it literally. That sentence arrived the way a clean cut arrives under a sharp blade, simple and decisive. I was in the back office of Roberts and Bloom just before dawn when the idea settled. The printer hummed an even note, the cooler clicked a soft metronome, and the world outside was still too sleepy to argue. I laid the flash drive from Thomas on the desk beside our original registration papers and felt something inside me line up with itself. I did not want theatrics. I wanted structure. Structure is how you teach chaos to mind its manners. I called Clara as the light lifted from gray to pale gold. She was my attorney long before she became a confidant, the kind of woman who could read a line of text and hear the subtext breathing behind it. She answered with that clipped calm she carried into every room and asked how bad it was this time. I told her the short version, a hospital rumor, a string of hotel charges, an audit file that tried to rename theft as efficiency, and a marriage that had been reduced to signatures in a drawer. She arrived by opening time, coat still cooling from the morning air, hair pinned back with the careless precision of someone who does not need to look fierce to be fierce. She stood in my office doorway, took in the spread of documents and the silver flash drive and the old certificate with both our names, and said, "We will not burn the house down to get the thief out. We will change the locks instead." We sat elbow to elbow at the little round table meant for invoices and vendor coffee. She opened her laptop, and I opened the ledger. She asked where the cracks lived. I showed her. Transfers during the months I was supposedly on leave. A sudden change in vendor authorizations with my initials forged in a tidy confidence that did not match my hand. A pattern of emails that started at midnight and ended with nothing in the folder by morning. She listened more than she spoke. Then she said the sentence that would become our plan. "You are not going to trick him. You are going to protect yourself in advance." Her fingers began to move across the keys soundlessly and quickly. We would file a document revision that clarified risk and governance. Quiet words. Not dramatic, but durable. Buried inside the revision would be a clause that had been present in spirit since the day I opened the doors. A precaution clause. Clause 9C. It would confirm that any unilateral transfer or undisclosed benefit would nullify related agreements and revert control to the founding partner whose contributions could be verified by audit. Not a trap. A fence that had always surrounded this garden. She paused to look at me then, and the look said, "Are you ready to hold the line after this?" I nodded. She nodded back. We were women who understood that silence is not surrender when it is paired with a filing number. The drafting took all morning. We pulled language from earlier bylaws, so every sentence had a lineage. We replaced anything that sounded like anger with phrasing that sounded like a ledger. The pen is a blade when it is steady. I signed the first set of authorizations and slid the paper across. Clara added her notes in the margins in a hand that looked like firm footsteps. When the printer spat out the updated packet, the sound felt like a heartbeat learning a new rhythm. We took a breath. Then came the part that asked for caution. Clara said you are playing chess with fire. I answered without humor that fire does not scare a woman who owns a kiln. She smiled at the floor the way people do when they approve of something they will not say out loud. I placed the packet in a plain folder labeled Updates and set it where Richard would find it before lunch. No glitter to attract attention. No language that would rattle a conscience already used to sleeping soundly. Just the work of grown people caring for a business. He had always loved the performance of stewardship. He would sign out of habit if not out of honor. Then we waited. Waiting is its own art. I watered the lilies and trimmed the excess leaves so the vases would not cloud. I confirmed deliveries with the courthouse and sent Ethan a message that read simply, "Proud of you," with a small heart, which I only used when I meant it. I kept my hands moving so fear had nowhere to sit down. At noon, Richard called from the road in that cheerful tone that has just enough gloss to slide past inquiry. He said he might be home late. He said he had my folder and would review the documents tonight. He said, "You know how much I appreciate that you handle the details." I said, "The details are where the story lives." He laughed lightly as if I had made a joke. Evening came wearing its usual script. He brought takeout and a bottle of wine chosen to match the label, not the meal. We ate with careful manners. He asked if the shop needed more help on weekends and if I had decided about repainting the front awning. He did not ask about the folder because men who prefer fog do not bring up the weather. When the plates were clean, he told me he would be in the study to answer emails. He lifted the folder with 2 fingers as though it were absolutely standard to him and disappeared behind the door. The house listened with me. The faint squeak of the chair, the soft thud of the folder on wood, the slide of a drawer, the sound of a pen that believed its own ink. When he came out later, he looked relieved in the way people look relieved after performing something only they think is noble. He placed the folder on the dining table and said, "All set, dear." I murmured my thanks and pretended to be engrossed in my tea. After he slept, I took the folder to the office. Every page had a signature in that confident hand. No notes in the margins. No questions. The signatures looked like bridges he believed would always hold. I placed the pages in a larger envelope and wrote the file number carefully on the front, as if I were sewing a name into the lining of a coat. The next morning, Clara would file the revision electronically and walk a hard copy into the county office for the stamp that makes reality behave. I slept like someone who had finally put a lid on a pot that had been boiling too long, not deeply, not without dreams, but without the helplessness that makes dreams feel like drowning. At dawn, I carried the envelope to Clara's car, where she waited with coffee that tasted like competence. She checked the signatures twice. She checked the clause again and then again. Then she smiled without showing teeth and said, "You just gave yourself a spine in paperwork." I asked how long until the updates had teeth. She said by the close of business and sooner if a hand reached where it did not belong. Those hours had the slow, quick pacing of surgery. I did inventory with a pencil because the body rests when numbers take the lead. I answered emails in full sentences that refused to tremble. I wrapped 3 sympathy arrangements for a family that had lost a grandfather and wrote a card that said, "May the love he built hold you steady." Writing that line, I felt something loosen in my chest. Even a florist can borrow strength from flowers when the vase is the law. At 2, Clara texted that the county had stamped the file. At 4, she sent a screenshot of the registry update. At 5, she called to say a verification notice had gone out to all account custodians with language that would freeze transfers initiated without dual authorization. The fence was up, not barbed, not electrified, simply there and visible to anyone who planned to hop on it. That evening, Richard arrived with a different kind of smile. He poured wine before saying hello and suggested a toast to growth, which sounded like a plan he had made in a room I was not invited to. I raised my glass and said to clarity, "We drank." He put his glass down too fast. He said he needed to run a quick wire for a supplier in Phoenix. He said it would save us on bulk costs, and did I mind if he used my laptop since his was updating? I watched the scene like a woman watching a play she had already read. I handed him the computer. From the kitchen, I heard the tap-tap-tap of a man accustomed to doors that open just because he is standing there, then a small pause, then a longer one, then the sound of a single sharp inhale. He called my name in a tone that belonged to a boy caught with an apple in his pocket. I dried my hands and walked to the doorway. He pointed at the screen with a laugh that wanted to be casual and was not. "Some new security thing," he said. "It wants dual authorization now. Must be the audit shakeup. Can you just click through?" I stepped closer and read the message as if it were a poem. Notice of procedural change. Dual authorization is required for asset movement pending review. Contact registered counsel. The words sat on the screen like soldiers who do not blink. I clicked nothing. I said gently, "We have been growing, and growth needs structure." He nodded quickly without hearing a thing. He said he would try again later and close the laptop as if the lid could put the world back the way it was. He went to the living room and turned on the television too loudly. I returned to the kitchen and set 2 plates on the table. The fork and knife looked like swords at rest. I lifted my pen from the counter and rolled it between my fingers. Such a small tool, such a clean edge. A signature had become the hinge of the door he could no longer walk through without me. That night, I wrote in my notebook, not a diary entry but a receipt. Today, the fence was built. Today, the gate knows my key. Today, the paper is my witness. Then I closed the book and turned out the light. There is a stillness that follows a clean boundary. It is not a triumph. It is the hush after a verdict, the quiet that lets you hear your own breath without interference. I lay in that stillness and felt the house shift back onto its foundation by a fraction of an inch. People imagine that power feels like thunder. For me, it felt like the click of a pen and the soft thud of a stamped file sliding into place. Justice sometimes smells like smoke and scandal. The siren found me first. It rose out of the afternoon like a blade, thin and bright, and then multiplied until the whole street vibrated. I was in the shop wiring lilies when the noise slid under the door and into my ribs. The bell over the entrance trembled with the vibration. I set the bouquet down and walked to the window. 2 engines roared past toward the river, lights shattering the calm. Someone outside called a friend to say that it looked like the river light again. The word riverlight felt like a match, striking in a quiet room. I locked the register and turned the sign back on. The sky had that flat metallic color that turns perfume sour and makes tempers short. I drove without turning on the radio. At each red light, my breath timed itself to the wail of sirens like a metronome for judgment. When I turned the last corner, the hotel stood ahead of me, the glass facade mirroring chaos. It was not fire that met me. It was the look on a crowd's face when gossip becomes a scene. Civilians pressed against the yellow line the way foam presses against a shore. Phones hovered in the air like small hungry birds. The riverlight's awning glittered with sprinkler water. A chemical sting rode the breeze, mingled with something hot and peppered, and a sweetness I recognized from the stitching of Richard's car seats. A smell can tell a story if you stop arguing with it. I stayed behind the crowd's shoulder and let sound do the work. Boots on marble, radio static snapping like sparks, orders given in short, clean lines. A man near me said it started in a 3rd-floor suite. Someone else said no smoke, then corrected himself and said not that kind. A woman whispered that the ambulance had already taken 1 person. Another guessed food allergy. The guesses hissed and cooled as quickly as they formed. Then I saw Ethan. He stepped out of the lobby doors with his helmet tucked under one arm and the other hand on his radio. He looked taller than he did yesterday, the way men look when they carry the weight of 2 roles at once. He scanned the crowd with the professional distance he uses to keep strangers from becoming stories he has to take home. Then his eyes found me. For a second, his posture flickered. He crossed the line and came close enough for me to see the sweat at his temple and the smoke dust on his collar. He lowered his voice without lowering its steadiness. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I said I wanted to bring flowers to the front desk later. I paused. Then I added softly, "Is it bad?" He looked past my shoulder toward the river, where the ambulance lights still spun against the water. He said it is contained. Then he looked back at me and chose honesty. "They think it started as a reaction to something in the room. Strong stuff. They called for medics fast." I nodded. He searched my face as if he were the witness this time. He said quietly, "Mom, they said it is Dad inside. The part of me that used to flinch did not. The siren had already told the truth." My voice came out even. Then the fire found the right address. He exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for both of us. His radio crackled, and he had to go. He touched my arm once and went back into the lobby with the stride of a man who knows that courage is mostly repetition. The hotel's glass doors slid open to release a wave of sound and conditioned air, and that scorched sweetness. Sprinklers had done their glittering work above the marble. A pair of medics hurried past, pushing an empty gurney back inside. The lobby concierge stood with damp hair and a practiced smile recalibrated for disaster. In all that movement, truth felt strangely still. It sat like a stone in the center of the room while everyone stepped around it. Richard came out under the awning minutes later, not on a stretcher, on his own feet. His shirt clung in damp patches. His face showed the tight control of a man trying to pull the curtain closed after the audience had already stood up. A medic walked beside him, speaking low and firm. The crowd's murmur rose, then fell back like a tide that had decided to be merciful for a moment. Behind him, hotel staff guided another figure quickly into a vehicle with tinted windows, a glimpse of dark hair. The shape of a wrist clutched at a sleeve. Lena disappeared before the whispers could agree on her name. I did not move. I watched the way Richard's eyes slid across the crowd and refused to land. That is what guilt looks like in daylight. Not tears, not rage. A refusal to meet any gaze that might be a mirror. He did not see me at first. Then he did. For a heartbeat, something almost human passed across his face. Relief, maybe, or the memory of what relief used to feel like. He started to lift his hand as if to wave off a mosquito from the past. I turned slightly and looked beyond him at the line of engines, at the water pooling under the curb, at the small rainbow forming in the spray. The gesture died. He let the medic steer him toward the bench. Lessons arrive while you are watching the wrong part of the scene. Mine was simple. Exposure always looks messy from up close. But if you widen the frame, you can see how it was always going to happen. You do not need to shove the truth into the open when the truth is allergic to being hidden. A reporter appeared with a camera operator and a practiced half-smile. She asked the concierge about the timeline and asked a medic if anyone was in danger and asked a guest if they smelled smoke. I heard the word reaction. I heard the phrase irritant present. I heard an older man say it burned like peppers and then shrugged as if he had said too much. The story did not need my voice. It was already telling itself. Ethan returned from the lobby, gave a set of instructions to a younger firefighter, and then came to me again. His eyes were clearer now, sorrow tucked behind training. He said quietly, "No fire. Just smoke from whatever they used. But people panic when they cannot breathe properly. We kept it from turning into something worse." He swallowed. He added, "I saw him. He will be fine physically." His jaw worked like he was bracing for the second part of a blow. I touched his sleeve. "Physically is a start." He looked out at the river. The ambulance siren dopplered away down the road, thinning to a thread and then to nothing. For a moment, the city felt like it was inhaling for the first time all day. Ethan said, "I have to file reports. Will you be all right getting home?" I said I would. He nodded and looked as if he wanted to ask another question but decided against it. Duty pulled him back into the building. I stood a while longer at the edge of the crowd as the hotel staff mopped the marble and the last of the onlookers drifted to their cars. The heat in the air tipped from sharp to stale. The sweetness faded. What remained smelled like water and glass and nerves. The Riverlight facade shone like a cleaned conscience. Places have short memories. People keep the long ones. On my way to the parking lot, I passed the service entrance. A housekeeper stood near a rolling bin of wet towels and spoke to another woman in Spanish. I do not speak much, but I understood enough. Strong like chilies. No one could breathe. Poor girl. The other woman crossed herself. Then they went back to work because the world keeps asking you to pick up a mop, no matter what truth you just witnessed. I sat in my car with the window cracked and listened to the hotel resume its composure. Somewhere inside a vacuum started to sing a low song. Somewhere outside, a gull complained over a scrap of bread. My hands rested on the steering wheel. They were steady. The scent in my own car told a quieter story now. Leather, soap, something almost clean. On the drive back, I did not think about vengeance. I thought about the sequence. I thought about how a choice ripples outward across rooms and days and bodies until it finds the edge of itself. I thought about how mercy and consequence are not enemies. Sometimes they walk the same road at different speeds. At home, the shop was waiting with its honest laborers. Water buckets, scissors, stems are to be trimmed so the blooms can last. I unlocked the door and stepped into the cool. The lilies on the counter had opened further, white throats lifted. I whispered to them as if they were the only ones who would understand. The world saw what it needed to see. We will let the rest arrive in its own time. As evening fell, quiet returned to the street, the way balance returns to a body after a long inhale. I brewed tea and sat on the stool behind the register. In the distance, a single siren floated and then dissolved. I thought of Ethan's face under the hotel lights, and of Richard's eyes sliding away, and of a girl being hurried through a door. I did not bless or curse them. I left the judging to whatever keeps score. The shop clock ticked in its patient way. Somewhere between 1 second and the next, I realized the lesson the day wanted me to take. Truth does not need a hand on its back. It walks out into the open when it is ready, trailing smoke and the faintest spice, and it does not look back. Courtrooms smell nothing like justice, but today I brought flowers. I carried a small vase of white lilies into the gallery and set them on the bench beside me, not for show but to remind myself why I was here. The room was polished oak and cold light, the kind of place where truth is expected to speak in complete sentences. I folded my hands and felt the weight of paper in my bag, a soft rustle like a heartbeat. Evidence is quiet. It does not clear its throat. It simply waits for its turn. Richard sat at the defense table, shoulders squared, jaw set in that performance of dignity he practiced in mirrors. Across the aisle, the prosecutor organized exhibits with the patience of a gardener, aligning rows. No Lena in the room. I knew where she was. Indicted last night on preliminary counts of fraud and computer misuse, the law writes its music in small notes first. The bailiff called the case. The judge entered, robe sweeping, expression unreadable. A gavel struck once, and the air braced itself. The prosecutor began with dates, not accusations. A ledger of time. He spoke of Roberts and Bloom Floral Company and the revision we had filed, Clause 9C, drafted as foresight, not as a trap. He did not say betrayal. He did not need to. He showed the audit trail where my signature had been lifted from earlier documents and pasted into places I never stood. He projected metadata with timestamps that landed like footfalls you cannot deny making. Then came the stills from Riverlight. Not tawdry, not violent. Just ordinary frames with extraordinary clarity. Richard is entering with Lena, a hand on his shoulder. 2 billing entries to the same card number I had reconciled 100 times at our kitchen table. The prosecutor did not linger. He let each image breathe for the length of a single breath, as if to say, "See?" then moved on. Richard's attorney objected to relevance. The judge listened and then let the exhibit stand. "Context is not gossip when it shows motive," he said, and the words hung in the wood-paneled air with their own weight. The prosecutor turned to the revision, and Clause 9C glowed on the screen in unromantic font. It stated that any undisclosed transfer, any unilateral movement of assets, any private benefit by an officer would nullify related agreements and revert control to the founding partner whose contributions could be verified by audit. He asked the clerk to enter the original partnership certificate. My name beside his name. Ink that had faded but not disappeared. He asked me to confirm. I stood. "Yes," I said. This clause was filed as a precaution after irregularities raised concerns. It was not designed to entrap. It was designed to protect a company built with my hands. I did not look at Richard when I sat down. I looked at the lilies. One petal trembled as the air conditioner sighed. Richard was sworn in. His voice tried to sound like a man surprised by events he barely witnessed. He spoke of tax efficiencies and busy seasons and how paperwork sometimes moves faster than conversation. The judge asked a simple question. "Did you obtain your wife's explicit consent to remove her from ownership?" There was a pause that felt like a floor, considering whether it could hold a house any longer. Richard said it was implied, then corrected himself and said it was for practicality. The judge did not tilt his head. He only wrote a note. The prosecutor returned with the flash drive Thomas had compiled. He explained the chain of custody like a prayer said backward. He opened an email thread recovered from Lena's office system. Not lurid, efficient. It showed draft language for an asset transfer using my digital signature file. It referenced installing remote access to our home machine to apply the mark cleanly. He asked the forensic tech to testify. The tech did, patient as an accountant, clear as a bell. Then the question that mattered. "Sir, can you state with certainty whether Mrs. Roberts applied her signature to these documents?" The tech answered. "With certainty, I can state she did not." The room did not gasp. It only grew stiller. The judge asked if I wished to speak. I rose and held the back of the bench like a railing on a moving train. "Your Honor," I said, "I have spent years trimming stems and wiring blooms so they hold through heat and handling. This company is not an abstraction to me. It is my work and my steadiness. I did not consent to be erased. I filed a clause to stop exactly this from happening. I seek balance, not revenge." He studied me for a moment that felt almost human. Then he turned to Richard. "The law extends mercy when there is confession and repentance," he said. "Do you have anything else you would like to tell this court?" Richard opened his mouth and then closed it. Some men can argue with a jury. Few can argue with their own reflection when it finally stands up. Closing arguments were brief. The prosecutor kept to verbs. The defense kept to adjectives. The judge left for 10 minutes, which felt longer than most years. When he returned, his voice was even. "The court finds that fraudulent instruments were used to alter ownership and that Mrs. Roberts's precautionary clause is valid and controlling. Effective immediately, full control of Roberts and Bloom Floral Company is restored to Margaret Roberts. All transfers and authorizations executed without dual consent are void. Restitution of diverted funds is ordered pending forensic accounting." He paused. "As for Miss Harper, charges of fraud, unlawful access, and identity misuse will proceed to the criminal docket." Then he looked at me with that still gaze that judges use when they try to speak beyond the transcript. "Do you seek revenge, Mrs. Roberts?" "No, Your Honor," I said. "I seek balance." The gavel struck. The sound was not loud. It was exact. Those words did not give me back every year I had bent myself into the shape of a quieter woman. They did not stitch my marriage into something wearable. They did one thing perfectly. They put the furniture back where it belonged. As people stood, one lily petal loosened from its place and fell to the bench. It landed silently, a small white verdict, and I picked it up between finger and thumb. The petal felt cooler than the room, softer than the wood, steadier than my pulse. I tucked it into the notebook where I now keep dates and orders and the sentence I wrote the night before. The law is not a hammer, it is a level. In the hallway, murmurs rose and ebbed. The prosecutor nodded to me, professional, kind, without reaching for sentiment. Outside the courthouse doors, the sun was too honest to flatter anyone. Clara joined me on the steps with the stamped order. She did not hug me. She simply handed me the file and said, "It is done." Her voice made done sound like a doorway rather than an ending. Across the plaza, a news van idled. A reporter lifted her chin toward me, a question forming. I shook my head and kept walking. The story did not need narration. It had a record. On the ride home, the city looked ordinary. Trees were trees. Crosswalks blinked their instructions. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve for a popsicle. I felt something ease at the base of my neck where vigilance had lived for too long. I thought of Ethan at the station and how courage can be a helmet and a clipboard on the same day. I thought of Richard sitting in a house that would feel bigger now that the lies had been carried outside. I did not bless him or condemn him. I let the grace of distance do its work. Back at the shop, I set the vase on the counter and placed the order on the shelf with our original certificate. Paper beside paper, structure holding structure. The lilies opened a bit more in the late light. A petal detached and drifted onto the ink like snow landing on stone. Justice had not roared. It had arranged itself petal by petal until the shape was undeniable. Balance had not broken anything. It had simply corrected the angle of the room. And as I locked the door, I understood the quiet lesson the courthouse had handed me. Real justice does not scorch, it restores. Every wilted flower deserves another chance to bloom. That thought came to me one morning as I stood in the workshop behind the shop, surrounded by stems that had outlived their prime. Some were browned at the edges, some bent under their own weight, but when I touched them, I felt the life that had once traveled through their veins. The instinct to give up is easy. The discipline to begin again is art. I switched off the overhead light and let the daylight decide what was worth saving. The trial had ended weeks ago, but endings are liars. They pretend to offer closure while quietly opening new doors. The town had moved on. Newspapers had shrunk the story to a few polite paragraphs about corporate restructuring and legal integrity. I had returned to work. The customers came back, slower at first, as if testing the air. Word of mouth carried the update. Roberts and Bloom were under new management. People like renewal when it comes wrapped in humility. Ethan stopped by more often now. Sometimes he came straight from the firehouse, smelling faintly of smoke and steel, his uniform creased in all the right places. Other days he came in civilian clothes, quieter, like a man who hadn't yet told himself his next chapter. That morning, he stood at the counter, running his fingers along a spool of ribbon. "Mom," he said, "I think I'm done." I looked up from the arrangement I was tying. "Done with what?" "With chasing fires," he smiled without apology. "The work matters, but lately I keep thinking about building instead of putting things out. Maybe it's time to help make something last for a change." The words landed like a slow sunrise. My son, who had once built model engines at the kitchen table, is now talking about permanence. I asked what he wanted to build. He said something simple. Something that teaches hands to be gentle again. Maybe here. The back room still held the old flour-drying kiln, the one Richard used to call my unnecessary toy. It had been silent for months, a metal skeleton waiting for purpose. I walked over and brushed dust from its edge. "We could start here," I said. "Teach others to preserve what they love instead of letting it rot." He grinned. "Like second chances in a jar." The name came that afternoon when we were labeling dried petal jars for donation bouquets. "Second bloom," he said, testing how it sounded. I repeated it aloud. It felt right, like breath after tears. The plan grew the way vines do quietly, then all at once. We cleared the back room, scrubbed the windows until sunlight spilled through like forgiveness. I called Clara to help register the nonprofit arm, and she handled the paperwork without comment. She had that knowing smile of someone who trusts the long arc of decency more than any verdict. Ethan reached out to the local youth program. Within a week, we had 6 students, some teenagers, some older women looking for something to do with restless hands. The kiln, once meant for drying stems, now hummed softly as it baked lessons into memory. Teaching them was like relearning how to breathe. I showed them how to press petals between parchment, how to mix resins, and how to wire delicate frames so they stood upright even after drying. Every week, the workshop smelled like lavender and glue and new beginnings. One of the older women, Ruth, told me her husband used to bring her roses every Friday until he forgot what Friday was. She held up the small wreath she had made and whispered, "Now he'll remember again." I touched her shoulder and nodded. Healing hides in small gestures like that. Ethan became the heart of the place. He was patient in ways I had never been with burned fingers, broken stems, cracked glass. The firefighters stopped by sometimes to help with deliveries. The town council took notice. Then one afternoon, as I was cataloging our invoices, he leaned against the doorway with that half smile I've known since he was 5. "Mom, the city wants us to decorate the courthouse for Founders Day." I set down my pen. The courthouse. The same marble halls that once held my trembling hands steady while I signed for freedom. The same echo that once carried the sound of the gavel. I took a slow breath. "Perfect," I said. "Let's bring them lilies they thrive after storms." He laughed, but I meant it. The lilies had become my compass. Their scent used to remind me of loss. Now it whispered resilience. The next week, we filled the courthouse with blooms that had been preserved by the students' own hands. They looked fragile, but they'd outlast any fresh bouquet. Judges, clerks, and secretaries walked past the arrangements with surprise, softening their features. No one said a word about my case. They only asked who made these. I said the city did. Every one of us, in pieces, learning how to hold shape again. When the event ended, I stayed behind to tidy the tables. The halls had emptied, leaving faint echoes of laughter and heels. I looked up at the skylight where sunlight poured through and thought about balance, not the kind the law enforces, but the kind the heart learns when it stops needing revenge to breathe. That evening, Ethan and I sat in the workshop, the kiln still warm. The air carried traces of pepper from an old jar on the shelf, though I hadn't used it since that day. "Funny," I said, "how something that burned once could feel harmless now." He looked up from coiling wire. "Maybe it was never about the burning, Mom. Maybe it was about the light." I smiled. Sometimes the child becomes the teacher so gently you don't notice until the lesson ends. Outside, twilight painted the street in calm blues. The store's sign now reads Roberts and Bloom, home of Second Bloom workshops. People said the name sounded poetic, but to me it was practical. Flowers live again when you change their environment. People do too. Before locking up, I took a walk through the shop alone. Every shelf told a story. The jars of dried hydrangea from our first workshop, the framed photo of the students holding their wreaths, the check from the courthouse donation fund, pinned beside the quote I'd written on the wall in chalk, "Healing is the art of rearranging what's left." I turned off the lights, one by one. The room glowed in the soft afterlight, petals shining faintly like embers that had chosen peace instead of destruction. For the first time in years, silence did not feel like absence, it felt like alignment. Later, at home, I brewed tea and sat by the same window where I once waited for sirens. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the workshop. Ethan texted that the last delivery went fine and that he'd join me for breakfast tomorrow. I typed back a heart and watched the steam from my cup rise and vanish, the way pain does when it's finally ready to let go. I looked around the house, its walls repaired, its air lighter. Not the house that forgot my voice anymore, but one that had learned to listen. The scars of betrayal had become lines of design, proof that beauty often begins where symmetry breaks. Every wilted flower deserves another chance to bloom. It wasn't just a metaphor anymore, it was the law of life. In that law, there was no revenge, only restoration. And as the night deepened outside, I realized that was the truest kind of justice when the fire you survived becomes the warmth that lights your way home. It's funny how something meant to burn ended up healing me. That thought arrived on a slow afternoon when the shop was empty, and the light came in like a kind guest. The windows wore a film of dust that turned the sun into soft milk. On the sill sat a jar of pepper I hadn't used in a long time and a vase of white lilies opening without hurry. The jar wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a reminder that heat can be measured. The lilies weren't an apology. They were proof that softness survives what tries to scorch it. I stood there with my palms on the cool counter and listened to the building breathe. Second Bloom had been full that morning. Ruth finished a frame of dried roses for her husband's nightstand. Maya, all elbows and ideas, pressed forget-me-nots between sheets of parchment as if saving tiny blue skies for later. Ethan moved through the room with a calm that made other people stand up straighter. The kiln hummed like a contented animal. The whole place smelled faintly of lavender and clean paper. I kept thinking restoration is just commitment disguised as patience. Then the bell over the door rang, and the mail slid through. The envelope felt light. Cream paper. No return address. A neat, careful hand. When I turned it over and saw the initials they used at the facility, the air thinned. I poured tea first and waited until the steam rose and softened the moment's sharpness. Then I opened it. "Mrs. Roberts," it began, "I don't expect forgiveness. I expect you to throw this away. But I wanted to try telling the truth somewhere. They let us garden here. I planted lilies because I thought I could stand the scent again if I faced it long enough. I was wrong at first. Then something changed. Watching them open made me think about the kind of love that holds steady even when it's not seen. You taught me what love should have been, not a secret, not a transaction. A responsibility. I am sorry for everything that sentence can carry. If lilies ever make you smile again, I know it will not be because of me. But I hope the world gives you more light than we stole. There was no signature, just a small pressed petal taped inside. White, fragile, braver than the words around it. I sat very still and let the letter rest between my hands. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel wounded. What I felt was distance, finally honest. Some apologies are not bridges. They are lanterns hung on the path you're already walking, so you can see your own footing better. I slid the letter into the drawer beside the original Roberts and Bloom certificate, paper beside paper. A map of how we got here. Ethan came in from the workshop in that way he does, knocking with his knuckles even when the door is open. He saw my face and didn't rush. "Do you want to talk?" he asked. I shook my head and smiled. "I'm okay." He leaned on the frame and waited anyway. So I told him, "Not everything. Enough." He listened without trying to fix it. That's the thing about grown sons. If you let them, they meet you where you are instead of where they wish you'd be. When he went back to the students, I stood by the window again. Outside, wind threaded the street and set the awning to a quiet flutter. I could hear a piano from the cafe down the block, a slow melody that felt like rain remembering how to fall. I touched the pepper jar, turned it once, and heard the faint rattle. This is what control sounds like when it's no longer angry. A soft note, not a threat. I've been thinking about forgiveness more than I ever wanted to. People think it's a door you open and then you're through. For me, it's a window I keep cracked so the smoke has somewhere to go. Margaret, I told myself in the voice I use when I arrange lilies, forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's letting go of the smoke. I said it aloud to hear how the sentence sat in the room. It stayed. It fit. The shop closed early that day. I hung the sign and turned off half the lights, leaving everything a little dim on purpose. Dim lets you see what glows on its own. In the workshop, the kiln was cooling, a soft ticking like a clock reconsidering time. The students' projects were lined on the table in neat rows, a forest of second chances. I added a note to the schedule board. Courthouse installation next Thursday. Bring extra wire. Beneath it, Ethan had already written his reminder. Hydrate. He's always been a practical poet. At home, the house didn't feel like a place that had betrayed me. It felt like rooms that had learned new names. The kitchen smelled like citrus from the cleaner Ethan likes. The hallway hummed with the low comfort of electricity and habit. In the living room, I put the pepper jar on the sill beside the lilies and opened the window. Wind found the glass and made a quiet sound like fabric shifting on a chair. Somewhere far off, the piano picked up again. A few notes that rose and settled. I let them stitch into the walls. I took out a clean card and wrote a message to myself the way I write for customers who can't find their words. To the woman who did not burn down the house. To the woman who learned where to draw the line and how to hang curtains on it. To the woman who kept her hands steady when other people's mouths shook. I tucked the card into my recipe box, between lemon loaf and birthday cake. Sweetness is a choice. I wanted mine nearby. After dinner, I called Clara to share that the city had extended our workshop grant and that the courthouse wanted us back in the fall. She said a single sentence that felt like a benediction. Balance likes you. Keep feeding it. Then she asked about Ethan, and I told her he was steady and that steadiness is the most handsome thing a man can wear. She laughed and hung up with a promise to come by for dried lavender on Saturday. Night came tenderly. I made a small ritual of it, the way you do when you've lost and found yourself in the same house. I turned the lamps low. I watered the lilies until their throats shone. I set the pepper jar where the last of the light could touch it but not warm it. I opened the letter from the facility once more and read the line that had surprised me. You taught me what love should have been. I didn't know what to do with that gift, so I did what I do with most fragile things. I put it somewhere soft and let it be. Maybe that's the point. Not to declare victory, not to perform grace, to live well enough that both happen without ceremony. Before bed, I stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood was a hush of sprinklers and the occasional car sighing past. The sky held more stars than last month, as if the season had decided to forgive us too. I thought of Richard without bitterness. I pictured him in a kitchen somewhere else, facing his own quiet. I hoped it taught him something about the price of erasing and the relief of telling the truth, even if only to himself. That hope surprised me. I let it stay. I went back inside and paused by the window. The lilies glowed pale against the dark. The pepper jar threw a small, honest shadow. I touched the glass lightly and felt the cool travel into my skin. There's a moment in every story when the music changes key, and you don't notice until your body relaxes. This was that moment. The theme had resolved not loudly, but completely. Tomorrow there would be deliveries and jokes from Mrs. Peterson and a teenager in the workshop who would break a frame and learn to rewire it. Tomorrow, the courthouse will email and ask for a few more stems. Tomorrow, Ethan would arrive early with coffee and say he'd been thinking about a community wall where people could hang tiny pressed blooms with the names of what they survived. We would say yes. We say yes to things that teach the hands to remember tenderness. I turned off the last lamp. In the dim, the room felt like a held breath that had learned not to rush. Wind moved through the open window. Somewhere, a faint piano drifted and then faded to nothing. I let the silence settle the way you settle a bouquet in a vase, each stem supported by the others. Then I spoke a last, simple truth that belongs to anyone who needs it. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's letting go of the smoke. The words didn't echo. They rested. And I rested with them, a woman who once measured power in heat and now measures it in quiet, who learned to turn fire into light, who found her way home by following the scent of lilies through the dark. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.